a huge thanks to Madeline Marie and the whole team at Bond, who've done a fantastic job of certainly looking after us these last 24 hours. So I've been asked to give a UK perspective, and I should perhaps start by saying that I feel a slight fraud, because what's happened in England is it's education and education policy has increasingly become devolved to the devolved countries, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So the data and the experience I'm going to give is actually about England, not the whole UK. But I think the trends we'll talk about are all largely similar. So with that in mind, let's first of all have a look at, I guess it's the England equivalent of the data that Keitha shared with us from Australian data from last night. And I guess we ought to get the language right to begin with, because I talk about postgraduate taught students, and I think you talk about postgraduate coursework students. So I'm going to be those are the students I'm going to be talking about. I'm not going to be talking about PGRs, postgraduate research students, students doing their PhD. We've got lots of those too. We've got about 5,000 of those reading PhDs for us at UCL, so I can talk about them maybe at the coffee break, but this is going to be about postgraduate taught students. And so I think the first thing to contrast with what's happening here in Australia is that we're seeing, and this is from 2010 onwards, a steady increase in the numbers of students who are studying for PGT degrees. These are one-year MAs and MScs typically, are increasing, but we're seeing a very significant decrease in the interest of students to study part-time. So, and that's something which we're also seeing at the undergraduate level as well, but at postgraduate level, it's particularly marked. And one thing, it's on this scale looks a bit of a kind of a blip, and but nevertheless was important. 2012 was an important year in UK higher education, or certainly in England, because of course 2012 was when we saw the very significant, the tripling of fees for undergraduate students. They went from about £3,000 a year to the current £9,000 a year. And there was a real anxiety at that point. And even though these students weren't affected, because obviously the 2012 intake of undergraduates have just graduated this year on their 3-year programs with that much higher tuition fee debt than they had before. This coincided with, for the first time ever, we saw a decrease in the interest of students in studying at postgraduate level. And that sets the context for what I want to talk about access and funding, and then I will talk a little bit about employability at the end, because as we'll see, the Higher Education Funding Council funded a very significant project to have a look at what are the different ways we can fund students to study postgraduate education. And two things from yesterday's discussion struck me by way of sort of compare and contrast. One was Bill Eckersley saying about you're seeing an increase in the diversity of your postgraduate student body. The worry in the UK is that we're not seeing an increase in the diversity. If anything, we're going backwards. And we really want to see about, are we enabling all students who wish to progress to postgraduate education? And it's not just something for the well-off. And the other one was in the fantastic student panel yesterday afternoon with Jim Smith, because he was actually the only one who mentioned funding, about how do you actually support students to undertake postgraduate study, because that is a key determinant of how satisfied they're going to be and their stress levels during their studies. So I want to talk about how we're thinking about funding. So this is the other one, just to compare international students with home and EU. And of course, as I say home and EU, my mind is very much on June the 23rd, which is when Britain takes its in-out referendum for the being in the EU. So I really hope on June 24th I'll be able to say we're still in the EU, but it's looking very on a knife edge, alarmingly at the moment. So we tend to think of home and EU because they have the same fee status, and outside the EU. And so the story has been a very a continuing rapid rise in the number of international students, despite the best efforts of our Home Office to make visas really hard to get, and a somewhat steadier rise, apart from this blip that was the worry of home students. So that's kind of the contrast with Keitha's slides from last night. A tiny bit, so I'm going to sort of dip in and out of what's happening nationally and what are we doing at UCL, just to kind of get our eye in about what UCL is. So it's University College London. We're heading towards our 200th birthday. We were 190 just a few days ago. It's a very large institution. We have 6,000 academic and research staff. We've got about 14,000 staff in total, 11 faculties, 36,000 students. I'm responsible for about 31,000 of those. And what's interesting, we are unusual for being a very large multi-faculty institution for having a majority of postgraduate students. And so the things that Tim Brailsford was saying in opening the session yesterday really struck true, because we tend to go in with that mindset, it's all kind of about 18-year-olds and there's a few postgrads as well. Well, for us, it's definitely not. We have more postgraduates and a more diverse postgraduate student body than undergraduate. It's kind of, it's very big. So our turnover is 1.2 billion this year, sterling, and we are profoundly research intensive, which can sometimes bring its challenges when one's leading education. And so Nobel Prizes, Fields medalists, there's a lot of them. So it's a fantastic place to be. So our numbers, these are just some of our equivalents of the two we looked at previously. We haven't seen that decrease in part-time study at UCL. The numbers aren't anywhere near as great anyway. But you may be asking, goodness, you thought you had a good year. When was it last year? Well, that very significant blip, you can see, well, it's not a blip, it will continue, was that the Institute of Education, which was a postgraduate college of the University of London, it merged with UCL, so that blip up is seeing the numbers being merged together. So the IOE, and I think I've met a graduate of the IOE today, the IOE is now part of us. And similar thing by fee status. So in total now we're looking at something around, how can we do the maths, sort of over 15,000 postgraduate taught students, and that's the largest number of postgraduate taught students of any university in the UK. So the question that's kind of niggling us is postgraduate study, is this the new frontier in widening participation? We've done a lot to try and open up universities to students from a whole range of different family backgrounds and prior or no experience of higher education, and with some success. And it's a struggle in what are slightly uncomfortably known as the elite institutions such as ours. It's hard, and we have to really work hard at it. But the worry is that is access to postgraduate study the next frontier? We've also got the question, which is kind of playing out right now, because we've now just this year was the first cohort of bachelor's students on 3-year programs who graduated with a hugely increased debt compared with those that went before them. Having had that debt, would they still have the appetite for postgraduate study? And then what were the kind of financial support needed to encourage and enable students, irrespective of their sort of family and income backgrounds, to be able to undertake postgraduate study? So The Funding Council launched this scheme called this trial, the Postgraduate Support Scheme. It's the largest intervention ever in postgraduate education in the UK. It was £25 million, 20 projects, and it involved 2,000 students. And we had the largest project out of that. We had £2.3 million to have a look at ways, different approaches to basically get to the question of funding. How could we unlock the funding that would enable students, particularly from less advantaged backgrounds, to postgraduate study? Just a bit of context. So what does our postgraduate student body at UCL look like? And we surveyed a few of them, not a massive number, it's over 400. And from that, what you immediately see is that certainly the profile of our students, they don't look like the profile if you just walked out into the streets of London. So 40% of them have been privately, so that should be or privately or grammar school educated. Nationally, that would be, I don't know, around 7 to 10%. So a way overrepresentation of those that have had the most privileged education. Only 18% had come through widening participation programs into their undergraduate study. But irrespective of that, more than half of them were undertaking part-time work while studying, and just about 9% had caring responsibilities. So you can kind of argue, well, a sort of a diverse student body, but when you look at that, that's not diversity. So how do we spend the 2.3 million? Well, we spent it on bursaries and developing a bursary offer. We did 93, and you might think, well, that's not too many, but by the time you give them all £10,000, that's nearly £1 million to start with, and then you do tuition fee waivers, that's the other £1 million gone. So it's quite expensive. But alongside bursaries, and I'll show you how we developed those bursaries and how we decided who should get them, we also tried summer schools to encourage students who felt that postgraduate study wasn't for them. And we also had some real success with mentoring as well, and I'll talk briefly about that. So the bursary scheme, what those 93 bursaries looked like? Well, it was a full fee waiver, so no tuition fees at all, and also £10,000 to help with living support. £10,000 is quite a lot of money until you live and travel and study in central London. It's not that generous, but it was as generous as we're able to be. And we tested that through looking at family income, and more than half of our recipients had a family income of less than £15,000 a year, which is not very much, particularly living in southeast England. We also took into account whether there were care leavers. I don't know whether you have that here, this notion of polar grouping, essentially where you can just assess through postcode what the kind of area that people live in, about whether people in that area do go on to higher education, what's the sort of average income status, socioeconomic status of the area. So we have those data, so we were keen to see that they were, whether they were from underrepresented areas. We did look at socioeconomic class. We did look at the school status, what kind of school had they come from. So, for example, had they been a student on free school meals, etc. And then obviously we also looked at their personal statement. But that's how we determined who got the money. So what about the summer schools? Well, the summer schools were kind of curious. They were terrific, but what you can't say, quite rightly, when you open up a summer school and a taster course, you can't just say, only the disadvantaged can come here. You can't do that. So what you find is that the sort of the people are a bit more switched on. You could say, in the health context, we talk about the worried well. You kind of get them. You sort of trying to get the sort of pointy-elbowed can come in as well. So when we ran our summer schools, they were incredibly popular, with the people who are already going to go on to postgraduate education anyway. Trying to reach out to those who was more difficult. So what we found was, 3/4 of them came from the top 3 social classes. Those weren't really where we were targeting. And so if you looked at the difference, was like 4 times as many from the highest social class as from the lowest social class. And of those, more than half had at least one parent who was a graduate. So, there was certainly family experience of higher education. But what they did do, and I think it's been really important, was helping to overcome anxiety and low confidence, particularly amongst those students who kind of had this idea that they were graduates, they'd been to university, but they kind of looked at postgraduate study, they looked at an institution like UCL and thought, is this going to be right for me? Will I be capable of studying there? So a really quite interesting dynamic there. We also used PhD students as mentors, and to mentor with both applicants and then working with them as they came on to their programs. And first of all, to say that PhD students did a fantastic job as mentors. They were really great. And it turns out it doesn't really matter whether they're from a sort of remotely cognate discipline, because the things that they can help with and support with are much more in the kind of generic space rather than the specific. It needn't be organizationally too difficult, and in fact we found that of the several hundred interactions and conversations that we kind of mapped and tracked, 80% of those were by email. And but what we did find was that it really helped the students to improve their confidence and also the cohesion of the cohort. So the kind of things we heard from Sally this morning about, should we try to get communities of postgraduate students to help together, while using the mentors did really help with that cohesion. And to have the mentors, there may have been 80% of things done by email, but the other ones, to have them present at critical events, induction was an obvious one, really did help with the cohesion of the cohort. And so the conclusions that we got was it should be, the mentoring isn't academic, so it's non-academic, but it needs to be there really early to help students to have the confidence to make that commitment to postgraduate study. So stepping back, so that's what we did at UCL, stepping back to what were the outcomes of that national program. So there were lots of other universities had a bit of cash to look at different things, different ways of supporting students, and being able to, particularly to fund them. What are the barriers? Well, there's kind of one which I guess is pretty obvious, and that's the financial one. The other one, and we've touched on it already, is about knowledge and information, the currency that of knowledge about how to get in. And certainly in the UK, there's a lot of support for you to transition from secondary school into university, a huge amount. But there's really nothing to help you transition from undergraduate study to postgraduate study. And we see that as a real gap. And it's maybe not so bad if you're one of those that kind of go straight through, do undergraduate studying straight on to postgraduate, but many will have some kind of, maybe get their career started, maybe have a family break, and just that knowledge and information, and to demystify what postgraduate study is really important. And kind of tied in with that is this notion of confidence, and that played out really strongly for us. And I think it probably reflects the kind of institution that UCL is, that people look at it and think, I don't know whether it's quite right for me. And doing that sort of demystifying, that role modeling was really important. So those things came out from the national study. And so there was also some national recommendations about how studies should be financed. Now, what's interesting about this is that, as usual, and the government, through the funding council, gave this money. We want to do a pilot. We want to see what happens, and then we'll make some decisions. Well, guess what? They made decisions before any of this stuff got evaluated or out. And the decision that came out was that that in the first year, so this year, there's been no support for postgraduate students whatsoever. So if you want to do postgraduate study in the UK and you are a Brit or from the EU, you've just got to pay for it or get a loan from a bank. So consequently, the numbers have really crashed this year of home and EU PGT students across the sector. What's happening for next year, still without really any looking at kind of things about what works. So what's come out is that students will have access to the student loan book, and they will be able to take out income contingent loans of up to £10,000. Well, £10,000 isn't really going to cut it, because that will include you'd have to cover both your maintenance and the tuition fees with that. And the evidence, certainly from our own work, is that won't do. So I think there's still a real concern that we're heading towards a system where the postgraduate study is still only open for the well-off. Okay, so next bit asked me to have a think about employability, and I think particularly what we're doing at UCL is there's a bit about employability, but there's also a lot about employment. Okay, the key thing about how do you help and support students, postgraduate students, to get into work. So, so some of this stuff, the first bit is there were some employability strands out of that big 25 million scheme. So I've just taken out one or two of the messages from that. Well, kind of unsurprisingly, particularly about why would you commit to doing another year, and we are talking about year-long courses in the UK for an MA or an MSc, why would you commit to doing it? Unsurprisingly, students rate enhancing employability as the principal objective for doing it. They want to see that getting them into a decent job. And then what do we then take if you then take the employer's perspective? Well, the first thing employers do is usually moan, and they'll say that graduates are not work ready. And they also want some, and it's very welcome, some input into developing the curriculum. And so there's been some good examples which you can pick out from the PSS website about where employers have been able to influence the curriculum, and there's also been quite welcome for placements, and which is quite tough in our one-year programs because there's not a lot of space to put them in. But even quite short exposure to the workplace can be really helpful. But I guess on the flip side of that, rather sort of less helpfully, what we found was that employers in the UK are quite reluctant to train postgraduate taught students. They would rather, they say, they would rather take students in at graduate level and develop them themselves. So they're not that keen, basically, on supporting students, i.e. paying their fees and helping them to maintain themselves, to study for a one-year master's. They would rather have them in-house and study. And particularly the engineers are very keen on the 4-year integrated or undergraduate master's programs as well, where there can be a little bit more time in the workplace. That leads to a master's qualification, and they're quite keen on those. So some reticence from employers about the value of PGT. So what about the value of the work placement? And there's experience both that's been developed in the UK, and I think also some experience in Germany, which is kind of like gives mixed results about the value of work placements. And placements can be of kind of 3 types. They can be either related directly to the program, or kind of somewhat roughly in the same area but not specifically doing a role, or just something which is very definitely just really extracurricular. Those three sorts. And there's differing evidence of the value of those. About some will say that having it, you can get a little head start and you can get going on your career a bit quicker. Other evidence will say, well, yeah, it helps in the first couple of years, and then 2 or 3 years further down the line, you don't see any difference in whether it's actually accelerated their career or not. But so a slightly mixed picture. And then there's this sort of, the slightly sort of, I don't know, the philosophical or the existential question about what's the point of postgraduate study. And the question really is are you increasing specialism, or do you actually want to make more competent generalists? And so some institutions, not my own, in the UK have even thought of what they're doing in their postgraduate programs, which they see as more generalist, as being kind of inverted Melbourne model. Okay, so you start, whereas obviously the Melbourne model, and forgive those who know it much better than me, but you sort of start general and go more specific. This almost goes the other way. Bachelor's degrees tend to be quite specific, and then should you open out and become more general at the master's level? And there's some interesting thinking about what may or may not be the best approach around that. So what have we been doing? And this is more about employment, these last 3 slides. What have we been doing at UCL? Well, I first of all have to have a sort of slightly uncomfortable confession, is that we've struggled a bit with getting our PGT students into work. Employment statistics are collected annually nationally, which is useful. There's a survey which you can access. It's called the DELHE, D-L-H-E, the Destination of Leavers in Higher Education, and its graduates are tracked 6 months and 3 years after graduation. And our DELHE data were causing me some angst, and therefore we needed to do something. So just to kind of a bit of context again, so this was these are data from our careers service. So we got a large number, the largest in the UK. Our courses are 1 year in length, largely. Very few are more than that. And I don't know about you, but we're really good at making amazingly niche courses. And we invent about 45 new niche courses a year, which people get really excited about. Then they will think, oh, how do I get into a job from this? And the other thing is that the deadlines for application, for literally getting that job, they're really early in the cycle. So pretty much you've got to be starting on this before you've even commenced your studies. And as I say, the context for us to do something was we were worried our destination results were a bit disappointing, is the polite term. So what do we do? And I've got 3, I think, rather busy slides left. They'll be in on your USB stick, so I don't want to say too much about them. But one thing we did, and Sally, I'm afraid I'm going to say MOOC, because from a MOOC, a SPOC got developed. So it's an online course, basically. So an online course that we offer to our students as part of their sort of application and induction process. So we get them thinking about the next step even before they've taken the step into postgraduate study. And it's been quite, we've only run it once, so we sent it out to nearly 9,000 students pre-entry, 1,500 engaged, 49 countries, and it was very flexible. You could kind of, I say, take it or leave it, literally. It's up to you. And there was a whole bunch of modules which were just to kind of get them thinking about work and applying for a role. So we've run that once, and we've certainly got great feedback. Don't ask me about has it changed your destination data yet? It's too early to say. But students are telling us that they find this stuff really helpful who've gone through it, which is encouraging. Then the 2 other things that we do is one is to put really intensive support for our graduates so they can use our career service for up to 2 years afterwards. We don't disown them on graduation. And we've also We do know what we call our most at-risk departments, programs that do struggle to transition students into employment, and we work intensively with those. The guys do a lot of telephoning. So, for example, 2,500 students were called to begin with. Just after graduation, 41% of them had not yet found a role. So there's a lot of work to do. And we have some intensive departments as well that we work more with. And intensive looks like this. So they get a dedicated careers coach. And so there's regular contact with the graduate. It's not just sort of one phone call and let them go. There's one-to-one careers coaching. And there's also graduate workshops, including one like building resilience. You've got to kind of get used to being knocked back. And progress is tracked individually. And so we've just rolling this out for postgraduates. We've been doing it for our undergraduates for a while. And in our intensive departments, we've kind of more than halved the rate of unemployment. So it is intensive, it is labour intensive, but it works. And I think particularly at postgraduate level, we do have a responsibility to work with and help our graduates into employment. We can't just have them here, take their money, give them an education and say clear off. It is not acceptable. So this stuff is really important to us. And then I think this is the last slide. We're also doing some other activities around provision of advice and guidance. And again, it comes back to that thing about knowledge and information. We can't just make assumptions just because someone's a graduate that they'll and then they're going to be a postgraduate, that they magically know how to do all this stuff, because largely they don't. And so this is what we've been trying to do with some workshops about career planning, application interviews. And this one, I just want to point out, is proving really important, because remember, these are PGTs, these are coursework in the Australian language. So, but many of them are really interested in progressing on to research, and even that is a bit of a mystery. And so we're finding that finding and funding a PhD are a really important part of that. And so those workshops, we've only done 8, and we've already put nearly 1,000 students through that. So it's about 15:15, so I think time is up. So you can see the worry is that in the UK that we're getting there's a real risk of a reduction in diversity at the postgraduate level. It just becomes something for the well-off. Not good. What can we do through financial support to do that? And then some of the things that we're doing to help our students right from the start think about that critical next step, transition into their first role and getting their career going. Thank you very much.